Thank you all so much for coming. There's a lot of you, and you're all so attractive. It's really an honor to be here, especially I remember coming to so many events here, and I'm thrilled to be up here reading for you. I'm just going to read from the beginning of the collection, the first story called The Contravida, and it's the beginning, so I don't think you need that much in the way of explanation. My mother was waiting in front of our house when I rode up in a taxi. "There you are," she said, as if we'd simply lost each other for an hour or two at a party. I only half embraced her, afraid she might break if I held too tight. She hadn't been able to collect me from the airport herself. Years ago, my father had forbidden her to drive, though I supposed he could do little to prevent it now. "Let me," she said, reaching for my suitcase. I waved her away. I would no sooner allow my mother to carry my suitcase than allow her to carry me. "Oh, Steve," she protested, "you don't know my strength." She dropped her arms, flattening the palms against her lap, a habit I remembered well. Throughout my childhood, she often looked to be drying her hands on an apron, whether or not she was wearing one. In the decade since I left, she hadn't aged exactly. To my eyes, she seemed not older, but more frail, more tired, softer spoken, her dark, teaspoon-shaped face cast farther down. Every feature I remembered had settled in her and been more deeply confirmed. My parents still lived in Mabini Heights, a suburb of Manila and monument to a time when they belonged to the middle class. My father had called himself an import-export businessman before sliding through the years down a spiral of unrelated jobs, each more menial than the last and harder for him to keep. And my mother had been a nurse before he banned her from working outside the house altogether. But if they'd come down in the world, so had Mabini Heights. Ever since my childhood in the 70s, when so much of that middle class fled Marcos and martial law, houses had been left unfinished or carved up for different uses. Squatters set up camp amid the scaffolding and roofless rooms. Families took in boarders or relatives. Our own house had changed too. On its right, a gray, unpainted cinder block cell had been added, taking up what used to be a yard. My parents had cemented over the grass and built this sari-sari store 5 years earlier, selling snacks and other odds and ends through a sliding wicket to people on the street. The sari-sari compromised what I imagined was the dream of my parents, who grew up poor, a green buffer between the world and their world. The addition seemed to shrink the main house to a toy, its windows tiny and its clay roof something storybook elves might have built. Next to it, I felt gigantic. I hunched my shoulders as I followed my mother inside. I was convinced, walking behind her, that the dishes on the shelves were rattling. "Papa's in here," said my mother, opening the door to my old bedroom. The blast of cold came as a shock, then a relief. There was an air conditioner now, in the window under which I used to sleep as a child, and my old bed, where my father lay, was pushed into a corner. I saw from the straw mat rolled up beside him that my mother had been sleeping on the floor at night. Otherwise, the room was clean and bare and quiet as I remembered. Same white cinder block walls, same wood-tiled floors, same smell of mothballs from the same chest of drawers, if all faded a little, like an old photograph. My mother kept a tidy house, a trait we shared, and things probably lasted longer in her care. 2 oxygen tanks stood beside my father's bed. He breathed through a tube. The sight of him brought me back to New York, where I lived, and to the hospital where I worked as a clinical pharmacist. My father no longer resembled me. The short boxer's physique, A bullish muscularity I'd always detested sharing with him was gone. In fact, he no longer resembled anyone in the family. He belonged now to that transnational tribe of the sick and the dying. Without the dentures he'd worn most of his adult life, my father's mouth was a pit, a wrinkled open wound below the nose. What I could see of his eyes under lids that were 3/4 closed did not appear to see me back. He looked not only thin, but vacuum-dried, desiccated, less a human than the prehistoric remains of one. He groaned, a low and heavy sound. "All right, Papa, all right." My mother took a brown dropper bottle from a chair next to the bed. "This used to hold him for a while," she said, "but lately he's complaining round the clock." Steadying his chin, she released a dose of liquid morphine into his mouth, with the dainty caution of a woman ladling hot soup or lighting a church candle. He let out another groan. "Shh." She stroked the sides of his face. Even bedridden and in pain, my father had managed to preserve their old arrangement. Whenever he called, she was there to wait on him. I had predicted this and how much I would hate to watch. In my suitcase, I carried an answer. Sucralol was the newest therapy for chronic pain on the market in America. White and square, the size of movie ticket stubs, Sucralol patches adhered to the skin, releasing opiates much stronger than morphine. Doctors had just begun prescribing them to terminal patients in New York. Sucralol could take years to reach the Philippines, a country whose premier pharmacy chain boasted "Laging bago ang gamot dito" as its tagline. "We do not sell expired drugs here." Still, something kept me from unpacking the patches right then. I did not want my mother to see my hands shaking, to know what I had done to bring them here in the first place, let alone the price I'd pay if anyone found out. "Is that better, Papa?" My mother returned the morphine to the chair next to a rosary, a spiral notebook, a folded white hand fan. She logged the dose into the notebook like the nurse she'd once been. I picked up the fan and opened it, rib by wooden rib. Its lace edge had frayed, but the linen pleats remained bright and clean. I remembered sitting in her lap as a child during Sunday Mass while she flicked her wrist back and forth to cool me with it. She brought my father to the doctor 8 months before, when he had trouble breathing and couldn't finish a meal without hunching over in pain. His belly had grown to the size of a watermelon, and from the veins straining against the skin, nearly as green. When my mother called me in New York and said, "liver cancer," I imagined my parents as clearly as if I'd been sitting in the free clinic with them. I saw my father shrug or grunt each time the doctor addressed him, as proud and stubbornly tongue-tied as he always became around people with titles and offices. I saw my mother frown in concentration and move her lips in time with the doctor's, as if that would help her understand. I saw her dab the corners of my father's mouth with a white handkerchief she always carried in her purse. Because of his age and his refusal, even after this diagnosis, to stop drinking, he never qualified for a transplant. At my mother's request, I wired money into a Philippine national bank account that I kept open for the family. Whenever someone needed rent or medicine or tuition back home, I sent what I could, having no wife or children of my own to support. In my father's case, I thought about refusing, but it occurred to me a relative might say he could get better care in America. His coming to New York for treatment and staying with me, or worse, in the hospital where I made my living, was something I'd have wired any sum to avoid. When chemotherapy did not stop the cancer spread to his lungs, when radiation did not shrink the masses, my father's doctor began to speak in a code we both understood: pain management instead of treatment, not recovery, but comfort in his last days. My money turned from doxorubicin and radiotherapy to oxygen tanks, air conditioning, the dark brown bottle of morphine. Still, I expected my father to survive. For all the years I'd spent wishing him dead, it was my mother's role in the family drama, not his, to suffer. Esteban has got some heavy hands, the family always said. Loretta is a saint. When she called to tell me end stage, my mother may as well have said we'd never lived under a clay roof in Mabini Heights, that I remembered my entire childhood wrong. Thanks.
It's so great to hear you actually read that, because I've read it so many times myself, but to hear it in your own voice was really kind of wonderful. So thank you for that. I wanted to start off by saying that there's a kind of joke that an editor friend and I have, that when you read a manuscript, when it comes in on submission, that you really get excited by, and this doesn't happen to us as often as we wish it would. But when something special comes in, you have this moment where your heart actually starts to beat a little bit faster, and your blood pressure kind of goes up. And you think, wait a second, I need to stop and not do the 150 other things that I should be doing, and I need to read this. And so that is the feeling that I had when I first read your collection. And it was sent to me. I felt like I just had to stop and read everything. And then also I felt like I wasn't irritated by the fact that then I was going to be running around and be knocking on people's doors telling them that they had to stop and read it too. So it's been really a treat to work with you and to work with you on it and to see it come out to lovely reviews. It's been wonderful and exciting. And so I thought I would ask you, because we haven't really talked about some of these things, how the collection came together. What was the first story that you wrote, and when did you become aware that you weren't just writing a story or two stories, but when you were writing a collection of stories and writing a book?
So I remember pretty clearly, actually, kind of a combination of different events and circumstances. So in the late 90s, I traveled back to Manila for the first time in about 10 years, the same amount of time that Steve in the Contravida has been away. And it was also for a family member who was ill and dying. Who was, I should mention, since I have family here, was a lovely person. Not someone that I wished dead and helped only because I didn't want them in America with me.
That's the fiction writer.
But you know, having been away so long, there were these kind of details and rituals and images around death and burial and kind of funeral practices in the Philippines that just struck me and arrested me in a strange way, because I knew that they must have been around when I was a child living there, but they were completely new and alien to me after so long. And you know, then when I went back to sort of my regular life as a college student in America, there were, this was around the time that that Junot Diaz's collection came out, Drown, and Kiko Lahiri's first collection came out, and they're two very different writers from each other, but it was the first time that I, you know, they were sort of painting portraits of very specific communities through these individual vignettes, and it was the first time I thought of my own memories and kind of family stories, both true and exaggerated, as material. I had been writing almost my whole life, poetry and some attempts at fiction, but that was the first time I started thinking about a story collection, because I just read two that kind of knocked me flat, and then from there tried to read as much as I could.
That was a special moment in publishing, I think, that moment
Yeah.
when those books came out. It felt really exciting, really
Mhm.
vibrant. So what is your typical process like when you write a story? Do you, is it a character who comes to mind? Is it something, I mean, like the trip that you talk about, is it a moment? How does it work for you?
So for the different stories, it's sort of ranged from, again, a memory or a personal experience that I wanted to unpack to an image or a character trait in someone real that I kind of wanted to explore more, to a news item that just felt interesting and interesting. Once I have that idea in my head, the rest of the process is sort of just inefficient and and long. I don't know if we need to get into it, but
I'll take your word for it. I think that will come as a relief to people in the room, right? That you don't just have these amazing ideas and then it pours out of you easily.
Yeah, no, I've never been the writer who can sort of sit at the computer with a blank page and like the blinking cursor and be like, the only way I can start writing a story is by kind of tricking myself into thinking that I'm not writing, that I'm reading and doing kind of like preparation and research, and then like I have a notebook nearby that I kind of take down my thoughts that occur to me as I'm reading. And then someone like you or Julie, my agent, will email and be like, how is that thing you told me you were working on? Show me? And then I try to kind of type up a draft out of these notes that I'm writing. But I'm always amazed and shocked because I go back to my notes and it always, inevitably, even though while I'm reading and taking notes, I always think that it's this like creative, fertile, generative process, and I'm like, just like I can't wait for all this brilliance to come pouring out of me. And then I look back at the notes, and it's basically the same sentence written 500 times in like only slightly different ways, and that's like really disheartening and somehow but it does help sort of clarify what the obsession is and what's drawing me to this subject. And then I try to write a draft, and it turns out to be wrong, and I revise it over the many months and years after that.
Well, one thing that you do so well, and that I think is really difficult to do in short fiction, is that all of your stories, they have this kind of natural arc, and then they have this turn. And to me, that's what makes the story really wonderful. And I'm just curious about, is that when you go into writing a story, how that evolves, or if it's just something that you're not even aware that you're doing the way the plot develops.
I definitely never know where a story's going to go when I start. I always start with, again, either an obsession or a question or a pair of things that I want to throw together and ask what if. So I don't have sort of an outline or a sequence of events in mind, and I feel I'm very glad that you think that there's a natural arc and turn in these stories, because sometimes it did feel like the turn. Well, something I'm insecure about as a writer is that thank you. Okay. That it's always sort of a goofy twist instead of a sort of quiet, natural turn, which I love in other people's stories. So I think that instinct for the goofy twist or the big reveal comes out of, you know, my non-literary influences, like, you know, Tagalog melodramas and things like that, which I talk about a lot in the book, in some ways as a way to you know, to address the insecurity, I guess, and say, I know this is what I'm doing, you know.
Another thing that I think sort of unifies the collection as a whole is that you're very good at capturing the moments where something crucial is going unsaid, where there is, you know, something, a subtext perhaps in the story where characters are referencing something and yet it's not being said. Is that strange to write about something that isn't actually on the page? If that makes sense as a question.
Is there a story in particular you're thinking of, Lexy?
We can also move on. Yeah, I think it's just, I think, like in The Miracle Worker, for example, there's a conversation or several conversations that take place between a woman who's come and is acting as a teacher to a wealthy woman with a daughter who has quite extreme disability, and there are many things that happen in those conversations or between the two friends that are really said, and you understand what is happening. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I aspire to moments where I don't have to say what's being unsaid, and the reader sort of knows what's happening, even if the characters don't, or even if one of the characters doesn't know what's being unsaid. I think it's hard to do, and I think that's why I have so much. I have so much admiration for people like Alice Munro, who can kind of get to the heart of the matter of what's going on inside someone, as opposed to what they're actually saying out loud or doing.
Right. Well, I'd love to talk a little more about some of the stories in particular. So one of my favorites in the collection is A Contract Overseas.
Mm-hmm.
And in that story, the narrator is struggling to write fiction that she feels compares to the adventures that her brother is having abroad. And I love the relationship between the narrator and her brother. I love the way you write about them. And I also wonder, from your perspective as a writer, do you feel that way looking around? Do you sometimes feel like you're looking at other people's lives, trying to pull from them? What is it like to sort of create stories, to create characters like this?
Well, A Contract Overseas was really fun and kind of revealing to me to write, because the narrator is someone who tries her hand at writing fiction. It became a way for me to kind of work through and talk about my own reasons for writing the stories. And you know, she starts out by writing about her brother being a laborer in Saudi Arabia and what he kind of goes through when he first arrives there. And in her case, it sort of becomes this strange, like, at first it's sort of a tribute to her brother and men like him who have made this sacrifice for their families, and then later in the story, without giving too much away, it turns out to be this sort of wish fulfillment for her, to keep her brother close to her, but he's not. So it made me ask those questions of myself, like if I was writing out of a sense of tribute or out of a sense of wish fulfillment, or you know, more political reasons, and I think for me the answer ended up being sort of a little bit of all of the above. But yeah, that story was fun and illuminating to me for that reason.
I've noticed in reading a lot of the reviews that have come out so far that a lot of people focus on the story Esmeralda, which stands out in the collection because it's the only one that is written from the second person perspective. And that to me is such a hard thing to pull off. I mean, I think to write from the second person perspective, you need to be able to do it really well. You need a really clear voice. I always think of Jay McInerney's Bright Lights, Big City as like a great example of someone who really was in control. So I'm curious what that was like for you to write from that perspective, and you know what your intentions were with it, because it's controlling in a way that that the third person or first person is not.
Yeah, it's very bossy, and people really don't like that. The earliest drafts of that story were written in second person, and I kind of had the sense that I wanted that from the very beginning. But you know, I got a lot of negative feedback in workshops and things like that for exactly those reasons. People sort of resist it and think, no, I'm not doing that. No, I don't feel this way. And what I decided for that particular story, even though I prefer in general to have a very trusting, kind of close and pleasurable relationship with my reader, I was okay with kind of having a more aggressive telling sort of relationship in that particular story. I think it was important to me to kind of insist on the person reading to identify with this person who might not share really anything in common with them. And yeah, I wanted to kind of call attention to how hard that is to identify with someone who doesn't share your life circumstances.
Is that what led you to write about 9/11? The story, for those of you who haven't read it, touches on 9/11 in a very particular kind of way. And it's a hard thing to write in fiction. We've seen a lot of people do it, some people well, some people not. And you get into it sort of sideways, which I think is very effective.
Yeah, I sort of the story came to be about, or set during 9/11 in a kind of accidental way. If you can call something that happens over months and years an accident. Yeah, I knew that I wanted to write about a woman who cleans for a living, and I knew that there would be some sort of connection that happened between her and someone she works for. But I had her in all sorts of things. I had her kind of cleaning fancy apartments on the Upper East Side, and the story wasn't coming together. I rewrote it in the third person, and that wasn't the solution. So I changed it back. It happened by accident because I started a residency in Lower Manhattan with Mia, sitting over here, where corporations sort of donate their vacant office space for the use of artists and writers. And it was a very strange, very fun and awesome experience to have, this separate space for 9 months to write and make art in. But it was also an odd kind of arrangement because we would generally be coming in at the time when the finance guys in their suits would be leaving, and then we'd be working into the night when people came to empty out the trash and clean the floors. So then I started thinking about Esmeralda being an office cleaner instead of a house cleaner, and then because it's really hard to work in that neighborhood without thinking about 9/11 all the time. I was sort of like, oh no, I don't want this to happen, but now I'm thinking, what if she was cleaning in one of the buildings, not a building? And so the only way, I told myself that I did not have to show the story to anyone, that I was just going to experiment with saying it during 9/11, but it ended up being, I think, right for the story, because 9/11 is so many of the narratives and testimonies that I started to read, again, because my office was like between where One World Trade Center was being rebuilt and, you know, the 9/11 museum had just opened. So many of the stories that people tell about that day are about kind of unexpected connections and intimacies with New Yorkers that you don't necessarily cross paths with. And that was what the story was about as well, for me. So yeah, that was how it became the 9/11 story against my will.
Without really being a 9/11 story, it's
Right.
just, it's a component of it.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked a little bit about, you know, writing about politics and how, you know, if you wanted to think of your book as political in any way, and I think the story where that's most clear is the last story, which is really a novella, and the title piece of the book. And that, for those of you who haven't read it, it takes up the story of Milagros, who's a fearless nurse in Manila in the 1970s, and she meets a reporter named Jim, and they fall in love, and things go on from there. And I'm curious what it was like for you as a writer to fictionalize politics. I mean, because the story is about violence and it's about repercussions and what that is like.
Terrifying and painful. I don't really know how to do it. I had decided on this subject, and so many of my favorite writers are the ones who kind of take historical events and political material and just really give you this personal way into it, and make you kind of see that it's not, politics is not something that happens, you know, out there, in Congress or on the news necessarily, but that it's something that actually happens, you know, that actually impacts people's daily lives in their homes. But I found it really, it was the hardest thing, I think, about writing the book. I wanted the political material, which could get really heavy sometimes, to feel like it was playing this organic role in the story. But I also wanted to be clear. I didn't want to avoid just telling people what was happening at that place and time, if it was important for them to know. And and that's where a good editor comes in, because she tells you where it's important for them to know.
Though I specifically remember I asked you at one point during revision a lot of questions, and then you turned back a revision, which didn't necessarily answer my questions, but filled in a whole ton of information that I hadn't asked for and was so much better than what I was suggesting that you do. So it was a good example of sort of me pointing out certain details, you not totally listening to what I was saying, and then making it so much better anyway, because it was making you, whatever that process started, it made you think about it in what way you needed to think about it in, and then it came back in a way that was very different than what I expected, and really great. That's what works, this process. Even if it's not what we think it's going to be.
Right. And I mean, one thing that made that I remembered from that process was that I was very frustrated about it at one point, and a friend of mine had shared this advice, which she attributed to Charles Baxter, but I have since Googled it and not been able to verify it.
We'll track it down.
Right. But she said, go to the body when it comes to trying to kind of personalize history. And I think that's really good advice, to kind of go back to the basics of what someone's going through in the flesh, and what's happening in the five senses when you're trying to kind of shed light on a more abstract kind of political context. at least it's great advice in theory. It's very hard to implement. But.
And this is not the last that we're going to see of Milagros and Jim, right?
No.
You are working on more about them. Will you tell us a little bit?
Yeah, there's a novel in the works, and it's going to take the main character in the title story, Milagros, and follow her life and the events that follow in the country, what happened with the country.
Well, I know I think I wanted us to wrap it up pretty soon, but I have 2 more questions for you. So they're just sort of trivia-ish questions. Your desert island books, your 5 books or stories that you would take with you on a desert island, or where you couldn't download anything. Or 2 or 3.
So I feel like 2 novels that really impacted me early on, when I was not necessarily thinking about writing fiction myself, writing a book of my own, but and if they sound very summer reading me, it's because I was that age. So I think Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison and Beloved by Toni Morrison. It just felt in some ways that the story being told over the course of the book was quite simple, but that you could read both of those books kind of over and over and just find something new and something different that they did each time. So I feel like those would reward me if I only had space for 5. Something by Alice Munro would be in there. It's hard to pick one from her, but I really like this collection called Open Secrets. It's one of my favorites. And what else was? I feel like if Alice Munro is in there, then Chekhov sort of has to be in there. So I would do some kind of collection of like his long stories, which have taught me a lot in terms of creating something as contained as a short story, but as kind of expansive and like forward-looking as a novel. And then I have to say, full disclosure, Lexy sent me some of these questions ahead of time.
I felt it was cruel to ask someone without warning what your favorite books are, or what you take with you, because it's a very hard question to answer. So.
No, I have to say that I was kind of stumped on a 5th one. Not that there aren't a million candidates, but like who would be, the 5th one after which there would be no others. I feel like I would have to kind of mix it up genre-wise. So I think there would be a poet or a nonfiction writer in there.
When you had to recalibrate your brain.
Exactly.
Well, the other question that was sent ahead of time was if you could invite, and we don't have to have this number, but if you could invite 5 or so writers, alive or dead, to a dinner party, who would they be and what would you serve? And you can take that in any direction you want. It could be 2 people.
Well, I would serve Filipino food because everybody loves Filipino food. And there would be a karaoke component to the event. They think they don't love it. They love it. But I was actually thinking of some people whom I've already mentioned. So I feel like Jhumpa Lahiri and Junot Diaz could like sit on one side, and then Alice Munro and Chekhov could sit on the other side. And again, the 5th person, I was kind of like, but like I feel like it has to be someone sort of very, very dead and just completely like cantankerous, like I don't know, like Hemingway or Flannery O'Connor or someone who, because like those other 4 seem like they'd be very civilized and
Fitzgerald. Or Fitzgerald.
So one of those.
Good answer. Thank you for bearing with my questions from all of you.
How did you find each other, or how did she find you?
Through her wonderful agent.
Yeah, so when I had been working with my agent for many, many years, and when it came time to sell the book, she sent it to the people who she thought would be interested in it as well.
Had you sent your work to the agent? Is that
I did, yeah. She had approached me after reading a story of mine in the Cincinnati Review, which amazed me in and of itself that agents were reading the Cincinnati Review for potential clients. Not that the Cincinnati Review isn't great, but yeah, and that was long before I had a full manuscript of short stories to shop around. She worked with me in sort of little clusters of 3 stories at a time until we had something to show people.
You mentioned Junot Diaz and Jubal here, how that was like an exciting time for publishing a book. Would you consider the past, like, say, 5 years as sort of an interesting, exciting time for Filipino and/or Filipino-American writers in terms of like Zach Linmar, Leslie Tenorio, Gina Apostol? It just seemed to be a lot more of those writers that weren't there like when I was a kid.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Leslie Tenorio's book, when it came out, I think it was 2 years ago,
Yeah.
just blew me away. That was one of my, if not my favorite book that year. And it's one of those moments where, you know, you think you're going to be kind of jealous and petty as a writer, because you know, you share some subject matter and all this stuff, and then you read it and you're like, nope, it's just awesome. Yeah, and Gina Apostol's book, of course. Yeah, I think I think those writers and other Filipino and Filipino-American writers have sort of always been around, and it's always strange to me when I hear about, it's the same thing with sort of short stories. Like there's always a renaissance that happens when I don't realize that they have gone away. But yeah, I think, yeah, I admire so many of those writers. Miguel Sibuco was a classmate of mine in grad school. He's phenomenal. One thing that I really loved about following those writers is that it's always struck me that Filipino-American writers, and again, I don't want to generalize, but in general, there's a few but they're not snobby. There's always this really interesting mix of high and low culture that they all just kind of bring in and use in really fascinating ways. And I love that. I love having that permission to not be so literary all the time if I wanted to bring other things into the mix. So I don't know if you have anything to add about Filipino.
No, and I
writers
feel,
and
I mean,
publishing.
you know, I will show my full ignorance here and say that I haven't read half of the writers you mentioned. And really, your book was my first real exposure. So I think there's still room for Filipino and Filipino-American writers to make their way into wider American consciousness and into sort of popular reading habits.
This is a question about your future endeavors. How do you feel about starting a novel? Are you scared? Are you excited? How do you feel?
I'm scared and excited. I don't really know how to write a novel. I can say that to you now, because you're excited. But yeah, I'm excited to kind of teach myself. I had thought about short stories for so long and not at all about a novel, but it felt like a natural transition for me, just in terms of not being done with a character 30 to 35 page mark, which, I mean, a lot of literary journals won't even look at it, look at stories that long and consider publishing them. But yeah, it seems right, but I also have a lot to,
So it's like a challenge.
yeah.
But you're up for it.
I'm up for it. Yes.
What was your primary motivator that pushed you to finish your book?
Your anxious editor, anything down your neck, about to go on maternity leave.
Right, exactly. There's someone named Cleo who, kind of set a very hard deadline on
She's 6 months old.
finishing the book, which in the very late stages pushed me to finish. I think just in general, when I noticed that my mind was moving on to other ideas and other projects that I hadn't started, rather than continuing to obsess about these characters, that felt like, okay, I need to finish soon before I start getting bored and or starting these other projects and then just getting nowhere with any of them. So that felt like the time. Yes, Rosie.
Oh, I'm halfway through the book, and karaoke figures prominently. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I was wondering if there was actually an app to like count the number of times a word comes up in your book. It's not, an article or whatever. And I have a feeling karaoke would be up there. Well, it sort of came up naturally because I write a lot about these immigrant communities kind of getting together socially. And you can't, it's almost like you're censoring it if you don't talk about karaoke. It doesn't happen at these gatherings. And in the same way, someone asked me about food the other day, which was, sorry, I did something with the mic again, which was something I sort of, unlike karaoke, tried to avoid just because I feel like there's this feeling like some people think of it as stereotypical in like immigrant fiction, particularly Asian immigrant fiction, to have these sumptuous tables of delightful and exotic foods. But in the same way, it felt coy to not talk about it because it is something that figures so prominently, particularly in Filipino kind of immigrant life, because it sort of where it takes the added kind of burden of being the thing that brings people together and the thing that people bond over nostalgically. Yeah.
So your answer just reminded me of this question when you talked about, the idea of like being very exotic, which is something that I think a lot of writers of color often face when, they enter the publishing world. So I'm curious to hear specifically about what your experience was like being not just a writer of color, but a woman writer of color. And in the last few years, this huge thing trying to get more diverse books. I mean, just at BookCon, they had 100 people rallying against really diverse books. Were there any expectations from either yourself or others around you to try to fit into some mold of being an Asian American writer?
I feel like this is treacherous ground, but I think that I will admit that I think in the same way as when you're sort of putting together a college application, there is this, I wouldn't call it pressure, but the idea of kind of using whatever you can to get your manuscript in front of people. So if the angle is kind of like a geographical, ethnic one, it is hard to avoid kind of selling yourself in that way, as ugly as that word is. But as far as like my individual working relationships in publishing, my general experience was that just everyone I worked with was sort of this true believer, and just wanted the stories to work on their own, but also felt like that there was an important place for them, because some of these stories had not been as frequently told as stories about other populations. So yeah, I think there is a pressure in the same way that there is in the academic world to kind of distinguish yourself in some way, which is problematic because maybe that pressure isn't there for other people. I don't know.
That's a good answer. I mean, I think, from a publishing perspective, we wouldn't, I think that everyone wouldn't have been excited about your stories or the stories that we publish in general if they weren't really good. And then outside of that, you bring in your personal perspective. I mean, you're telling, you happen to have this unusual upbringing that you grew up in many places around the world, and there were a number of places, I mean, like growing up in Bahrain, for example, where I felt I hadn't read stories about that before, or about Filipino culture in Bahrain, and that was uniquely interesting to me because it was a story that I felt hadn't been told. And that, as an editor, is exciting to me, if it's something that I feel like I haven't read before. If that answers your question.
I think we have time for one more question.
What's your primary job as an editor? I mean, what is the book? I mean, what do you have to do with the book itself as an editor?
I just asked a lot of questions. Really, I mean, truly, that's the really fun part of my job. I mean, the editorial work is to ask the author, ask me a lot of questions about things that I wasn't sure were working, things about characters. Would this character have done this? Could you tell me more about this place or this character? There was one story that is not in the book that you will read that we ended up cutting because I asked a number of questions and then Mia felt she couldn't get it to where she wanted to be. So that's sort of my major role there. And then also to act as an advocate for her book inside the publishing house to get other people excited about it.